So with Season 2 about to be dropped, I'm going to start cranking out guides to help you guys do as well as you possibly can this season. This includes class guides, character guides, more how to counters, the return of competitive breakdowns, and other things I can't easily put into a category like this video. Now here's a warning, this video is probably going to be as basic as they come, and a lot of you probably won't find it helpful because again, these are the basics. This particular video is geared towards helping new players. Players that haven't had a ton of time to learn the game, but are still very eager to get into competitive. So let's get right into this. So before you go into competitive, you're going to want to have a few things down. For one, you're going to want to be reasonably versatile when it comes to characters. There are 4 roles in Paladins. You're going to want to know how to play at least 2 characters from each of those roles. Now when I say know how to play them, I don't mean you played a character once, had a good game with them, and that's it. You don't learn how to play a character in one game unless that character is super simple. You want to give the characters you pick at least a few games of play to get a decent feel of how to play them. Obviously, the more time you put into it, the better you'll be. Also, learning characters from each role allows you to see where you fit best. For the most part, people always want to play damage or flank characters right from the start, but if you try out all the roles and see you're doing better with tanks or supports, then you can focus on playing those in comp until you bring your damage and flank play up to that level. It'll make ranking up a lot easier. Another thing about characters. For the most part, Paladins characters are pretty new player friendly. However, there are 4 I recommend avoiding at the start, and those are Androxus, Bomb King, Eevee, and Maldamba. Now here's why I say avoid them at the start when you're learning your 8 characters. These 4 have the highest skill requirements out of all the characters in the game. Playing them well takes a lot of time and practice. Now if you decide to pick them anyway and you find that you're overperforming with them while practicing with them over the course of several games, then hey, you probably clicked with them, and in that case, don't avoid them. But more often than not, that doesn't really happen, so that's why I advise avoiding those 4 at the start. They can definitely be really good characters, but again, it requires a lot of time and practice. Now you're also going to want to have good loadouts for the characters you're playing. When starting out, you're not going to know what's best to run on a character just yet. So you could import builds from other players. Maybe you have a favorite streamer or YouTuber that you've been watching and you saw them do really well with one of the characters you're learning. You could use the import feature to get a solid loadout from them until you're at the point where you know the game well enough to build solid loadouts for yourself. You could also import loadouts from people on the leaderboards. If they're winning enough to be up on the leaderboard, then it's pretty safe to say they know what they're doing. Now, with the second season dropping, the leaderboard will reset, so you won't be able to get loadouts that way. This is mainly for the people watching the video sometime in the future, where the leaderboards are already set up. Also, when it comes to characters, don't try out new ones in competitive. You want to have 2 from each role practiced, because that's enough of a character pool to more or less safely play comp with. You don't want to use a character you've never played before, because you'll be a bit lost and confused and it'll give the enemy a big advantage. If you find that your teammates are pressuring you to play a character you've never played, don't give in. Tell them you haven't played them enough and they'll probably understand. If they don't and they keep pressuring you, then again, don't give in. You're better off playing something you can play rather than something you don't know how to. Now there is this situation that could happen. Your team still needs a certain role, like a tank for example, but the 2 tanks you can play are already picked or banned. You're new, so you haven't had the time to expand your tank pool past 2 yet, and that's fine. But in this case, even if you haven't played the tanks that are left and no one wants to trade with you, it is better to play a tank than to pick another support or DPS. If your team is recommending you one and saying that it's an easy pick, then go with that one and just try to use the basics you learned from other tanks on that tank. All the characters in a role have the same core characteristics, so as long as you focus on those, you should hopefully be okay. Now when it comes to picking and banning, don't do it selfishly. Again, you don't want to pick something your team doesn't need. If your last pick and a tank or healer is needed, you don't want to pick another flank or damage, because doing that automatically gives the enemy team the advantage since their team comp is complete and yours is not. You want to build a good team comp, so don't throw the game at the character select screen. So right now, the most standard and safest team comp is a damage, a flank, 2 tanks, and a main healer. 2 damage, 2 tanks, and a main healer with no flank also works well too. Not having a flank isn't a bad thing, but let's say you have 2 flanks and no damage. Now that's a bad thing. I do also want to explain what a main healer is. Main healers can consistently sustain a full team by themselves. Off healers are healers that can't do that. Currently the off healers are Pip, Grok, and Grover, and the main healers are Maldamba, Ceres, Genos, and Ying. At the start, focus on the main healers. There is a place in the game for off healers, but that's much more situational, and this video is mainly about the basics, so forget about the off healers for now. As for banning, you normally ban what's at the top of the meta, but if you're new, you're not going to know what that is. You'll get that down as time goes on. But for now, if you've noticed that something has been consistently giving your teams trouble over the course of a few games, go with that as your ban. Or if your teammates are all recommending you ban a certain character, then you could go with that. Again, this becomes different as you learn more about the game and move further up the ranks. Now we're moving on to what happens in the game. You pick your loadout and your legendary, and then that's when you buy your items. Items are very, very important. The items you and your team pick could easily win or lose you the game. So the first thing you want to do before you queue for comp is go to your settings and disable auto buy forever. Auto buy buys items automatically for you, and more often than not, they're bad buys. You want to be the one deciding what you're buying, not the game. So turn that off and never turn it back on. Now at the start of the game, there are only 3 items that you should be looking at and deciding from. That is Cauterize, Wrecker, and Chronos. Let me explain these items really quick. Cauterize lowers the amount of healing whoever you're attacking is receiving. This is very important because it lowers the usefulness of the enemy healer and keeps them from healing away your kills. Wrecker increases the damage you do to barriers. This is also important. The longer a barrier is up, the longer the enemy can do damage to you before you're able to do any to them. Wrecker allows you to melt barriers so the enemy tanks can't protect themselves and their team. Then there's Chronos, but we'll talk about that one in a second. So as far as Cauterize and Wrecker go, you normally want one Wrecker and the rest get Cauterize, except for your healer. Your healer gets Chronos because Chronos reduces the cooldowns of your character so they can heal you more often. Picking Chronos first basically depends on if you're playing healer or not. Now let's talk about who's the one person who gets Wrecker. Well first, if the enemy has no barriers, then don't buy Wrecker at all. If the enemy team has Inara and Terminus for example, then don't buy Wrecker. Inara's Wall and Term's Power Siphon aren't barriers. However, if there is a barrier, then you ideally want a heavy hitting burst DPS character on Wrecker. Bomb King, Cassie, Drogos, and Shaolin are all great Wreckers. Kinessa and Strix are good at it too. If you don't have any of those characters, but you have a Victor, Tyra, or Willow, then they can also do it. These 3 aren't ideal Wreckers, but they are still very good with it. It's just if you have the other characters I mentioned, then those 3 are better off on Cot. When it comes to Leon and the flanks, they're better off with Cot for the most part. Now there are characters like Talus who do have Cot in their loadouts, so they could run Wrecker. But again, I want to keep to the basics here. Vivian has a talent called Saparounds that gives her Wrecker, so you don't need to buy Wrecker on her. Now for the most part, you want to go straight to Cot 3 and Wrecker 2, before you buy anything else. You could go Wrecker 3 if the enemy has 2 tanks with big bulky barriers. As for Chronos, you can go to Chronos 2 or 3. 3 is pretty expensive, so if you feel like you want to get something else after 2, then by all means go ahead. Okay, so you have the important items down. Now onto the game itself. Now the game itself is where the meat of everything is, obviously. I could spend hours talking about the ins and outs of games and all the different situations that could arise, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to talk about the big things. So first, when you kill the enemy team and you get control of the point, you all don't have to sit there standing on the point. It doesn't cap any faster if you have more than one person standing on it. Leave one of your 2 tanks on the point, and then the rest of you move forward and do this thing called zoning. Basically, zoning is going away from the point, closer to the enemy spawn, and attacking the enemy team as they start to come back, to get them off their horses and keep them away from the point. While zoning, you want to be safe. You 4 need to have every route to the point blocked off, but do it safely. While zoning, your main objective isn't going for kills. If you get them, great, but don't make that your goal. Your goal is to keep the enemy back long enough for your tank to cap the point and get the payload. Once that happens, you and your team can regroup, and that's when you go for kills so you can push the payload. Now let's talk about ultimates. You don't want to hold your ultimates for too long. They come back after all, and you want to get as much value out of them as possible, but you also don't want to blow them. In the first round, you're not going to have ults. If you guys are able to get ults and the point fight is still going on, use them to win that point fight. When you get the payload, you also want to use ults to help push it, but here's the golden rule. Once there's only a minute left to push, you don't want to use ults unless you're close to pushing it in. If you're a minute in or even in overtime and your team hasn't moved the payload far enough, don't use your ults. If you do, then you're wasting them because with so little time left, your team probably isn't going to end up pushing it in. So it's best to save your ults and use them to cap the point. You always want to have as many ults as you can for the point fight. Now let's say you're really close to pushing it in and there's only 10 seconds left or you're in overtime. You can use ults to confirm that push, but be careful about how many your team uses. If you use them all and the enemy team uses none and that push doesn't end the game, the enemy will have the advantage going into the next point fight. If the score is 3-2 and your team can push it in for the win, then you could use them all, but keep in mind there's still a risk. Your team could use them all and the enemy could still end up defending it. Then it goes 3-3 and your team has no ults, so be careful about that. You basically really only want to ult to confirm a push if you're 100% positive that using your ult will confirm it. Now there's one more thing I want to talk about, and that's staggering. Staggering is when your team staggers deaths. Here's an example. 4 members of your team die, and you're left alone fighting 3 of the enemy team. You're doing your best to stay alive while fighting them as long as possible, but really all you're doing is staggering yourself. Without a doubt you're going to die if you keep fighting, and when you do finally die, your death is far apart from your teammates' deaths. So then your team is stuck either waiting for you to respawn so you all can regroup, or they have to go in and fight 4v5. If you notice your team is dead and you're left alive, you either have to get to safety and wait for your team to respawn so they can all regroup and try again, or you just run into the enemy and die so you respawn with your team. Dying is the safest way to regroup with your team. Getting to safety isn't so bad, but the enemy team can still go after you and stagger you, so my advice is to just die. Don't play for KD. KD means nothing. You want to win, because the win is what ranks you up. What good is KD if you lose? Now on the opposite side of it, if you notice that one of the enemies is left alive, try to kill them as late as possible so they can get staggered. So those are my tips for new players going into ranked. Again, this was probably a bit too basic for most of you, but I wanted to help out new players as well, so they could have an easier time too. If you are a newer player, then hopefully this helps you out. Good luck in your ranked games. And that's pretty much it, guys. I want to thank you all for watching. I very much appreciate it, and I'm going to see you guys later. Bye.